so this is kind of what we're going to be building today. So we'll start off with 2 circles. And then we add a dark background on one side of them. So the whole point of this thing is the illusion. Number one, it's fun. I want to move away from like professional web development type exercises. Number one, because there's so many of them online. We've seen 1,000 ones for nav bars that are sliding in and out, and how to create card patterns, and all of those kind of things. I want to kind of do something that really is focused towards creativity. So using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in ways that normally we wouldn't be doing, and kind of looking at it from the aspect of self-expression. So not as a way to make money or to sell something in a shopping cart, but basically to treat the browser as almost like an artistic canvas. So that's kind of what I'm going for. And I've built this little application. It's a work in progress. I'm not finished it yet. But what we're going to be doing is going to be focusing on this main area without the checkboxes. I might do further videos on how to actually hook up the JavaScript on this. But basically, this is the illusion that they're like completely identical circles, both using 50% black, so gray. And you can kind of see it. It's a very subtle effect that this circle, when you have different backgrounds, looks a little bit darker than this one, which is should look a little bit lighter, even though they're exactly the same color. But then once we actually add an image over top, it actually like really shows. It really enhances the effect quite a lot. So we're going to go step by step, creating these 3 layers as illustrated in this article. So going into this, so a couple of you are beginners, novices. These are the kind of the prerequisites for what we're going to go for. Is that, just HTML basics, basics on CSS. And there's going to be quite a bit of box model. So these 3 links, these are all going to link to the MDN. So the developer network is kind of the proper version of schools. So if you've ever done any searching on Google and you've come up with W3 Schools, for whatever reason, everybody goes to that site. It has a bad reputation for being inaccurate. It's not very well updated. So I linked everything to the MDN. Now, the Mozilla Developer Network, this is a really great resource for professional developers. It's a little dry. So I'm linking these more so that you guys have the terminology in your head so that you can go and search yourself using these terms and find the types of tutorials and articles that kind of speak to you. Because this is dry. It's perfect for me because I'm kind of a pragmatic developer. I love kind of getting right deep into it. What's great about the MDN and any of these links that the point to the MDN is that you can be pretty confident that they are accurate. And if you want to do something a little bit, more along the lines of video tutorials and articles, then that would be up to you. Kind of figure out the best way or the way that you guys like to learn and go after those resources. So these are not meant to be like the be all end all. It's more for a starting point if you want to keep researching this and kind of working on your craft. So that's what we're basically going for. Today I'm going to be running everything through CodePen. So this is actually a side effect of the library sessions that these are basically based on, is that everything has to be run in a Chromebook. So we have no VS Code, so I'm not going to be using VS Code. I'm going to be using CodePen. Luckily, I got a pro version, so it should look a little bit nicer than what you guys might get. But we're going to be doing everything in the browser today. Going into the actual illusion itself and the activities, this is basically how I did it. So I want to kind of bring out this idea of convergent and divergent learning. Like, even though I've given you guys sample code for this, this is only one way to solve these problems. So if you guys have another way of doing it, if you want to challenge yourself, kind of go off in this direction instead of this direction, awesome. This is your journey. You can use my code if you want. I've actually built this so that all of the code, if you copy and paste it, line for line into a CodePen or into an index file, it should just work. So I'm going to be basically stepping through this bit by bit. So the way that we've broken this out is more from a project problem solving perspective. Whenever you have a large problem, first step is to break it down into smaller problems, conquer them one at a time, and basically science the shit out of it. Just kind of like knock one down, one after the other, and don't get too overwhelmed by the entire big picture. So the way that I've kind of, that I did it when I figured it out is that there's 3 layers really here, and this is like an overlapping exercise on how to overlap elements. We're going to start with 2 gray circles, and we're going to place them in the center of the viewport. Then we're going to take a split color background. We're going to put that behind the circles in the viewport. And then the last one, which is actually a big one, is going to be creating a semi-transparent image and overlaying it on top of the entire viewport. And by viewport, I mean the window itself. So this is the viewable portion of any web page is called the viewport. So this is kind of what we're going to be going for. This is kind of breaking the mold of what other tutorials will be. There's no text. We're not doing any paragraphs. We're not doing any inline elements. We're barely doing block elements. We're going to be playing more in the realm of flex and also grid later on. So going through, I'm just going to give you guys an overview of where we're going to be going. Then we're going to stop for questions. We've given you the sample code here. This is the structure that we're going to be going with, and I'm going to be live coding this, so I'm not going to be copying and pasting this. So my beginning results, the code that I'm going to be starting with is not going to look like this. This is actually the finished code. What I want to do is kind of go through the process of how a developer might think about a problem. So I'm going to brute force all of this code. I'm just going to make it ugly, and we're just going to kind of get it to work. And then once we get like a good prototype going, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back, and then we're going to start breaking apart the code. We're going to do a walkthrough and figure out like what could be improved, some of the ins and outs of why you wouldn't want to do some things some ways and why you want to do things other ways, depending on what your situation is. So when I go through on this first run on the brute force version of this, if you see something that just kind of strikes us like, wow, that's a really dumb way of doing it, it might be an actual dumb way of doing it. But I'm going to come back later, and we're going to kind of go through what we would think about after we kind of get a proof of concept done. What are some of the things that we need to think about to create dry, reusable code? Some of the pitfalls that we might run into, how do we handle some of those? So this is going to be kind of the structure that we're going to be going for. We've got a couple nested elements in here. This is mostly for the Flexbox. We're going to get into that about what a container and what items are. Objective 1 is going to be basically just to get to this point where we have the 2 circles. And that's basically broken out into 2 main objectives. Number 1 is going to be creating those circles, and this is going to be mostly box model. And then we've got the centering of them, and we're going to be using a flex for that. And we're going to be playing a little bit around with how flex works, but flex is almost like a misnomer in this one, kind of giving you a red herring, because we barely need flex to actually get the job done here. We're only using flex to kind of change the way that the browser thinks about margins. And then objective 2 is actually only 1 objective, but it's kind of split into 3, where we're going to be creating the split background. And to do that, we're going to be hacking a linear gradient. This is kind of a popular way of creating split backgrounds. And even though this is technically overlap, we're kind of cheating, because this is the overlap that we get for free, because when you're talking about box model, when we're putting a background, the background is always going to be underneath the content. So we kind of get free overlap in this case. And we're going to go through the 3 versions of kind of the same exercise, where we're going to be doing a linear gradient here. This is just going to be the default. Then we're going to change the direction of that gradient. And then we're going to play around with the color stops to create this fine line of color that separates these 2 circles. And then depending on where we're at for time, by the time we get that, we might take a break, because objective 3 is, like I said, the larger objective in this. It's actually 3 mini objectives where we're going to create a viewport-sized image. Now, this is where we're kind of going to go down the divergent side of things, where convergent meaning that there's only one answer. 1 + 1 = 2. That's a very convergent test question. A divergent test question would be, for example, tell me in 1 minute all the different uses that you can think of for a brick. How many uses for a brick can you have? And you just list off as many as you can. That'd be a divergent question. So I'm going to be splitting off. I'm going to be diverging on here. So even though I've given you guys the code for the CSS image, we're going to be doing an HTML image for the purposes of this presentation, just because I think it would be fun. And also there's a couple of things that have changed with how browsers operate since 2019. The way that you're supposed to be using images has changed. So I just kind of want to touch on that. Then we're going to overlap the image. And again, I'm going to diverge. In this code, I've given you the way to absolutely position the element. This is the classic way. It works all the way back to IE. Nobody ever got fired for using absolute positioning. But we're going to go and do a more modern version of overlap using CSS grid. So it's going to diverge a little bit, but I will cover what's happening here. And then the last one, the pièce de résistance, is the semi-transparency, which actually is kind of anticlimactic. It's a pretty simple and straightforward line of code. We'll talk about that for probably about 5 seconds. And then we got some extra stuff. So depending on how much time we have left at the end of the session, or what you guys want to do, I'm not really kind of tying this to any particular kind of goal for what we want to build. If you guys kind of want to go off in a different direction, I want to kind of touch on resets. I'll probably do resets not at the end, but halfway through when some things start to piss me off. You'll know when that happens. And then finally, we're going to finish off with mobile considerations. Now, this is where I want to kind of go over some of the assumptions that I'm kind of going off of for this. I mentioned earlier that kind of what we're going for is self-expression. Let's just be creative. Let's kind of think of the canvas as like an artistic medium. So I'm not going to be touching too much on browser support, for example, in the kind of vein or the worldview of self-expression. The only browser that matters is yours. So we're not going to be touching too much on browser support. Again, we're not going to be talking too much about performance. Some of the code that I'm building, sometimes it's not the right way to do it in production. So we're not kind of going for production code. For example, we're here to basically just to learn and to have fun. But the one thing that we are going to do is talk about mobile, because I want to get you guys to the point where at the end of this session, you have something that you might be proud of, that you want to share. And if you're sharing with somebody else, yes, you can email somebody a link and they can go to your CodePen, or if you want to use GitHub Pages or host it somewhere else, that'd be fine. But what if, say, you're at some future networking event, once we're allowed to have networking events, and you want to show somebody something that you built and you want to text them that link, it's going to show up on your phone. And the way that we're going to be building this won't look the best on the phone. So what we're going to do is take a look at some ways that we can kind of play around with media queries, and some of the things that we have to think about, like what do we want this thing to look like when it's in a portrait orientation on a phone? Which way do we want to go with that? And if you guys are interested, the final demo is here. This is actually one of the links that I've posted in the chat. So if you guys are new and you don't have access to the chat that I just gave you guys, if you go to the meetup, the links are on there. I've also sent you guys an email. So yeah, we're just kind of go step by step through this. I'm just going to live code it. We're going to be going pretty quickly. I will be stopping at every kind of mini objective. So I'm going to kind of stop and ask for questions at each of these points. So don't feel the need to interrupt or anything if you don't want to. Just kind of keep in mind, take a note of what the question is. And if I forget to go to stop for questions before I move on to another objective, hopefully one of you guys will pipe up kind of throw something at my head virtually, and then I will stop and actually answer those questions, hopefully correctly. Before we go further, does anyone have any questions on this? Has anyone actually gone through this article yet? I did send it yesterday afternoon.
Luke has a hand raised, but I don't know if that was just him testing it out or if he does have a question.
Sorry, that was left over from when you asked everybody to raise their hands when they were paid and stuff like that.
Yep, no worries, no worries. And I am just going to take this opportunity to catch up. All right, cool. So what I am going to do. So like I said, these are the 3 links that we're kind of going for. I am going to, I won't close that quite yet. Close that. We'll keep that open. So this is our blank canvas. So if you guys aren't aware of CodePen, it's awesome. I believe it was started by the guys who do CSS tricks. Can't remember the guy who made CSS tricks. You guys can totally look him up. You probably know who he is. We are going to be starting here. So this is going to be my blank slate right now. And if you guys want to follow along, what I will do, I'm going to take this and do a little tweak to it, because I just signed up for CodePen Pro today. So I want to try out some of these new fancy things that I now have access to. So if you click on that, it should open up with this side of the thing. You might be able to take a look at the code, I think, but it should live update on your end as I'm typing. So let me know if that's not working. We ran into some bugs while we were testing this. Sometimes I have to actually save while I'm doing this. So we're kind of going to go through this step by step, but let me know if that doesn't work, and I will save as I can remember. So I'm going to kind of go fairly slowly. So if you're an experienced developer, feel free to just kind of like look through some of the videos and just just ignore me. But basically, we always start with the same thing of the triad. The triad is really the 3 pillars that the 3 technologies that a browser is based on. And what CodePen does is it allows us to write code in these 3 technologies directly in the browser. So as I'm writing code here, it should be updating in here. And we do have the 3 pillars, which are HTML, which is for content. So in this big kind of world of any of the things that we can do in a browser, in general, when you're dealing with content, it's going to be stored in HTML. And I'm not going to go too much into like actual syntax or anything. This isn't the time or place for that. We do have the links if you guys want to catch up. So HTML, it's pretty simple. It is built from the ground up to be simple in order for I guess to be forward compatible. So the browser makers can actually create web pages that look the same across all different browsers. HTML does have to be fairly simple to do that. And in the content world, there's this idea of parent-child relationships within tags, so tags within tags, and semantics of what this content actually is. And we're going to go a little bit into that, but mostly what this session is going to be is all about CSS. CSS is my bag. I love it so much. And if you're not familiar, CSS is all about presentation. So within CSS, we have kind of the main pillars, which are typography, we have color, we have layout, animation, basically anything that is presenting the content. So the content itself is what we're serving. CSS is all about making it look nice and making it look pretty. And the third one is JavaScript. JavaScript is all behavior. So in practice, it's basically anything that HTML and CSS doesn't handle. And there's a lot of overlap here. CSS does handle a lot of behavior. So in general, if you get into web development and you kind of watch the specs as they develop, you'll find that things that we used to do in JavaScript are now going to be more and more done with CSS. As CSS grows as a spec, it's the browser makers have finally kind of gotten their poop together, so to speak. Back in the days of Internet Explorer, we had to wait maybe a decade or more for updates to the specs. But with CSS Grid only came out about 3 years ago, and all the browser makers kind of released it all at the same time, except for Microsoft. They launched Edge about 6 months later, but they're doing really well. They're actually doing very, very nicely. So you're going to start seeing a really nice kind of uptick of how often these specs are updated, so that they will actually, once something is launched, it'll probably be ready for production in about 2 years once all the browsers kind of update. And that's kind of the idea behind these technologies, is that they're always backwards compatible, so that any code that you write now will be usable or viewable in all browsers going forward. So anything that you write now should be fine 10 years from now, because you can't make changes to the spec that actually breaks backwards compatibility. The upside to that is that it's a wonderful platform. It's a world, like open source world standard for, I call it self-expression, but it also has some downsides in that they can't take anything out. I'm going to show you later on today, later on in the session, bugs that have actually gotten into the spec that can't be taken out, because if you take them out, it would break websites that were built on those specs. So it's kind of one of the things that's going to be one of the challenges as you're getting into this, if you're just learning how to code, is dealing with the emotional angst of having 1,000 ways to do things and not knowing which is the right way or the correct way. So I'm going to kind of look at a couple different ways, especially in the images, of how we used to do things and then how we can do things now. So some of the more modern ways that we do stuff. Because I found that even professional developers, they're, blinders are on, they have to hit these deadlines, and they have clients that need to have backwards compatible websites for IE. They don't get to use any of these fun things. There's a lot of developers I know that are working full time that still haven't used CSS Grid. Flexbox, yes, but Grid, no, it's not quite there yet for them. So that's one of our advantages, because we're not really concerned too much about browser support. Most of the stuff here is going to be good to 90% of the browser share. So I think that's good enough. But that's the basic overview of what these tries are and what CodePen does. CodePen will just allow us to do things. And I've added these comments here. So these basically map to the article. And we're just going to kind of go step by step. But before we do anything, we're going to need some content to actually play around with. So let's get back to our original article, and we'll get into this. I'm going to hide all of this.
Sorry, Tony, I hate to interrupt, but I don't think that link that you posted to CodePen is working for us.
The live one, or?
The codepen.io browser therapy /live. Yeah, that one.
Yeah, right now what it's going to be is completely blank because we haven't done anything yet.
Okay.
So
cool.
let's actually test that right now, just so that we know it's going to be working. So I'm just going to put in hello world. Oh, has to be an exclamation point. So do you guys see hello world on your end?
Yeah, we see it, definitely.
Yeah, okay, cool. So I don't know if you guys can see the code as I'm typing it, but you can see it on the screen. So this will just basically be the live view of what's actually going on. So why don't we actually just keep with this, and we're going to create a couple of elements. So we're going to talk about the box model a bit. And this is one of the deep, dark secrets of web development, is that we're not web developers, we're box developers, we're box designers. Everything that happens in the browser is a box. Everything is a box. There might be an exception, but I haven't found it yet. And I'm gonna show you what that is right now. So I'm gonna use basically a div tag. And if you're not familiar with what div tags are, div stands for divisive. It doesn't actually. Div is actually division, but anyone who's screaming at me right now for more semantic code, this is where the ugly part comes in. So div is a generic block level element. We're not going to go too much into what like block level, inline, that kind of stuff. For right now, the important part to know is that divs are kind of like paragraphs. So block level elements kind of just operate like paragraphs would. They span the full width of the page. And one of the tricks to them is that they actually don't have any height if they're empty. So if I do this, well, actually, let's do this. We've got our hello and we got our world. And over here, we've got hello and we've got world. So first step is that we want to have gray circles, right? So we're going to make these gray. And I'm going to do type selectors. So a type selector means that I am going to select or target elements based on what type of element they are. So I'm going to target every div tag that's on this page. And I'm going to give it a background of gray. And now we actually see what this box looks like. And something that trips people up quite a bit is that if I make this element empty, it actually seems to disappear. And it doesn't actually disappear. The thing to know about block level elements is that by default, and browsers always have defaults for every tag, and sometimes they change across browsers, so you got to be a little careful, is that they will be 100%, and they will be only as high as the content that it contains. So if it's empty, it will be 0 height. And the background is everything that is viewable inside that thing. So there's no height, there's no background. And we can confirm that by using the inspector. And I'm going to be going to the inspector quite a bit, just because, number one, it's perfect for figuring out what the heck is going on. You're going to be wanting to smash your face into the keyboard quite a bit dealing with CSS, because CSS has a just tricky thing of like not actually working when you actually want it to. So we're going to right click on this and we're going to inspect the element. And this is going to be us as magicians just kind of looking under the hood, behind the scenes, pulling back the curtain of what's actually going on here. And what you can do is in the inspector, we have this little icon here. So I can actually click on that and mouse over the elements. And I can click on it and it actually selects the div in here. It might be a little small for you guys. How does that look to you guys? Is it a little small? Might come out a little blurry for you. But when you go back to this one, this is the one that we just made empty. And the reason why it has no background color is because right here, this is the box model. So anytime that you want to take a look and look at what a box looks like, because remember, all we're doing is designing boxes. So it kind of behooves you to get used to this idea of what boxes actually do look like. And what this is telling us is that it's 814 pixels wide and 0 pixels high. So this is kind of an indicator of something you just have to think about. And you might ask yourself, like, why is it only as high as the content? And why is an empty element always 0? And it's because of just the byproduct of the way the content was built when the browser was first enacted or created, was that it's an infinite canvas. So if you're scrolling through Instagram, when do those images stop? When do you get to the bottom of the page? You never do. That page will go on forever and ever and ever. So when you're thinking about a limited page, it doesn't really make any sense to have things bigger than the content it creates. You just want to have it kind of shrink wrap. So everything's going to be shrink wrapping, and it's going to kind of hang us up once in a while when we're going through this. And I'm going to point it out when it happens. But for right now, I'm going to make these both empty. No, actually I won't. I am going to keep them full. I'm going to close this for now. And we're going to make these circles. So this is our basic box model where we need to make a width and a height because we don't have to actually go with defaults. So I'm going to go with a height of 200 pixels with a width of 200 pixels. So now we have these two boxes. We can't really see that they're boxes until we add a little bit of margin. Let's add a margin of 10 pixels. Spaces them out a little bit. And now we can actually inspect these again and take a look at this element. So the hello element, and we'll go to the layout. And we'll notice that now the width is 200 and the height is 200. Here we have our margin. So the margin is defined as the area, the spacing outside of a border. So the border is the definition of that box. That is the border of the box. And padding is everything in between the border and the content. And for right now, we don't have any padding, and we're not going to have any padding on any of these. We have no border. We could add a border. We're not going to. But we do have 10 pixels here, just to kind of make it look like these are actual boxes. Now what we have to do to not have a box is we make a circle. And circles can be done lots of different ways. We can use SVGs, we can use CSS shapes, but we're going to use the border. So this is also the box model. So the border being right here, there is a little declaration that we can use called border radius. And let's just give that border radius of 10 pixels. So you'll see that it's now a rounded corner. And the way that this operates is basically takes a circle with a radius of 10 pixels, so a full diameter of 20 pixels, if you remember way back to grade 5 or something maybe. And it puts a circle right here and then makes the corner kind of hug around there. But what we're going to do is we want to make a perfect circle. So what we can do is we can hack the border radius in order to make a circle. And it is going to be 50% of the width and the height. So we can do 100 pixels border radius, and now creates a circle. But you now see the deep dark secret of the browser. That box is still there. This is not an actual circle. This is a faked circle. It has no real indication of where the content is here. It's completely a facade. We're just kind of doing some hocus pocus. This is not a real circle. Even if we used an SVG, which is the vector graphics that would come out of Illustrator, and we actually make a circle, we put that into the browser, there's going to be a box around it. Everything is a box. So just don't forget that. So now that we kind of get this, so the box is actually from here to here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to delete these things because they're not really using too much here. There we go. And we're going to close this for now as well. So now what we're going to do is we need to get these two circles centered vertically in the viewport, equally spaced. And by equally spaced, I don't know if you can tell the dimensions on here, but this is basically the size of the screen. If you take and cut the screen in half, the circle is going to be centered in their respective half of the screen. So there's a number of different ways we're going to do this, but I'm going to kind of take the cheap way out. We're going to do it in 2 steps. We're going to use margin auto. So margin right now is 10 pixels. We're going to do the auto keyword tag. And what the auto keyword tag does is very dependent on what you're actually applying it to when it comes to the property. So margin auto is the default way of basically centering something as long as it's not as wide as its container. If it's smaller in its container, use margin auto to center them. And people often ask me, like, Tony, why does margin auto center things? Because CSS. It's just actually built that way. The auto keyword is basically us telling the browser, why don't you figure this out? This is too hard for me. I don't want to deal with this. Why don't you do this for me? And with block level elements, which is what a div tag is, margin auto only changes the left and right margin. So we can see that also if we inspect this element, that in the box model, we have auto here, auto here, auto here, which doesn't tell the whole story. If you want to actually take a look at the whole story, you can go to the computed values. So the computed values, this is all kind of like in the nuts and bolts of the machine shop that is the browser. And what we're looking at is basically all of the declarations that I have set on these elements right now. And if we search for margin, we get margin bottom, left, right, and top. And notice there is no margin. When I use margin auto, this is a shorthand property. It doesn't actually exist in the browser. This is only a way of actually developing this. But this is what auto does. If it's on the top or the bottom, it goes 0. Just because we don't want paragraphs to be spaced out. We only want it to be centered. So it's actually taking these pixels, dividing in half, and assigning it to the left, and assigning it to the right. And we can actually click on here, and we can actually start seeing, oh, this one's actually different. But as you get into it, if we close this off, we see all of the properties that we're actually setting here. And when you're thinking about CSS it's a declarative language, which means it's a what. You know, it's not a how, which is JavaScript. JavaScript is like, okay, how do you want this to be done? CSS is what is happening. So the way I look at it is I have a browser elf. I call him Dobby. He's the little creature in behind the scenes that's actually taking all of this code and actually creating a website for me. And the way I kind of look at it is almost like I guess a nuclear power plant where you have all those dials and flips and switches. That's all CSS is doing, is that when you write your CSS, it is actually flipping switches and settings behind the scenes that do particular things. So when we're doing margin auto here, because it's in a block formatting context, it only operates in the left and right. But what we want is we want, number one, we want these circles to go side by side. And we also want them to sit right in the middle of the viewport. And to do that, that's where we get into Flexbox. The problem with Flexbox, though, is that it is very, very dependent on this container item relationship. So I'm going to create a new HTML element. I'm going to paste them right into the middle. And in article, if you take a look at this, I've left a link to the complete guide to Flexbox. And if you're a developer, you already know that this exists. If you're working on Flexbox, you usually have the background. For some reason, it's not showing on my. And this is kind of what I want to, is this idea of the container and the items. So there's always one element that's going to be the container, and every direct child, so every element that's directly a child of the parent element is going to be a flex item. And there's nothing you can do about it. It's actually hard-coded into this. But when you're trying to make sense of this article, all of the styles on the left-hand side are applied to the containers. And all the styles on the right-hand side are applied to the children. So it can kind of get confusing which goes with which. But one of the great things about this page is that it's got pictures, right? So we're going to play around with this in a little bit. But for now, what we're going to do is take advantage of this parent-child relationship where we now have the main. So this is semantics now. I'm actually giving this a semantic tag, telling, for example, screen readers, this is the main item of the content. And now that I have this element, I now have a container that I can apply and target styles to. And we're just going to do a display flex on this. And you'll see quite quickly what the default behavior of flex is and why it was actually built in the first place. This is a more modern technology that we've gotten in around 2012. We only had inline and block level elements for the longest time, where block was paragraphs, inline was words. But when you get into like nav elements and, for example, which came first, flex or grid? Flex came first. So we've had Flexbox for since 2012. It is production ready. You can feel free to use it, unless you got IE, but anyone who has to deal with IE is totally used to that. But Flex is fairly safe to use nowadays. It's like 95% browser support. Grid, however, only came out, I believe, in 2016, maybe 17. So it's actually quite a bit newer. And completely, like it operates similarly in some respects. In, for example, it's got a container and it's got items, but it's in 2 dimensions. Flexbox is kind of like 1 dimension. Like if you just wanted to create a list, it's a neat and easy way to, for example, create a bulleted list and make it go horizontally for a nav bar. And you can see that right now. By default, it will actually go in the left-right direction in the row orientation. And the thing, though, is that this marginato in Flex, when it's applied to Flex, operates in the left and the right and in the top and the bottom. And that is by design. Grid is the same way, because this is kind of the old holy grail of things that we never used to be able to do, is center things in the center of the viewport, which right now it's just sitting at the top. We want to get down to the bottom. And 10 years ago, this was really not trivial to do. It was kind of a pain in the ass, and people complained. When you think about the old browser, think of everything as a bathtub, and the content is bars of soap. So everything floats up to the top, and everything kind of like always gets pushed up to the top. There's no way to tell a bar of soap to just kind of sit and float in the center of the water in the bathtub. So one of the things that Flex does is it actually operates when it's in auto. It'll do the same thing in the left, right, and in the top, bottom. But do I have a theory as to why this is not centered right now? Because it should be. We've got display flex here. We've got marginato here as the item. So remember that, here, let's do this. Okay, so now we can see both. So we have the container and we have the children here. The marginato on the divs should be pushing it down into the middle as soon as I added display flex. Can anyone guess as to why this is not kind of happening? What's the problem here? What do you think the height of this container is?
As tall as the divs.
It's the height of the content.
So let's inspect the element. And we go down into our main, and look at that.
It's the height of the content.
Yeah, it's the height of the content.
Viewport.
And that's the thing about margins, is that in order for marginato to have any effect, there has to be extra space. That's the thing about margins. And something that will trip you up as you're getting into this is there's this idea of inside the box and outside the box. And margins generally only operate on elements that are either a fixed width, that is smaller than the container, whereas if it's like 100%, like squeezing right up to the edges of the container, there is no margin to actually put an auto on. So what we're going to do is we're going to force this container to be full viewport. And in order to do that, we're going to take advantage of one of the newer units, because I used pixels here. Pixels, it's weird. In theory, if you did 96 pixels, it should be 1 inch high on any device that you're working on. Never works out that way. So what they've given us is viewport units. So I am going to give this a height of 100 VH. And then boom, and there we go. So that was the problem, is that, you know, it just wasn't there. And that little specific thing of the fact that it was not high enough isn't the important thing here. The important lesson is, how did I figure out that the height wasn't there? Always inspect it. Whenever something doesn't operate the way that you think it is, go and inspect it. Get used to going into those layout tabs and getting into the computed values, going in through your through the properties, because it will tell you. Firefox is really good at telling you why and when CSS will work and when it won't work. So just think about that. Okay, so I think what we'll do is I'm going to, let's see, we've been at it for a bit. Why don't we do the split background really quickly, and then we're going to take a quick 10-minute break, and then we're going to go back and get the images. So split background. Kind of tough if you kind of think, oh, I need to make a box and I have to put it behind one of the things. But no, it's not too bad. Because like I said, the background is going to be going underneath the circles. So all we need to do is we need to apply a linear gradient. And that is done with the background again. Technically, it's applied to the background image, but just to keep things simple, I'm just going to apply it to the shorthand property, which is smart enough. The background shorthand property is actually pretty smart. You can get away with using it quite a lot for almost anything. And we're going to use our first CSS function. So what this function does is it basically creates an image on the fly. It just happens to be that image is going to be a gradient. So we first start off with white, black. It'll take two colors. And already you can kind of see where this tissue illusion, this illusion actually happens, where you can kind of see this weird thing where it looks darker at the top of the circle and lighter at the bottom, just from using this gradient. And it's kind of telling, but it's going in the wrong direction. So what we want to do is we want to go from left to right. And you can always look this up in the spec, but I'm going to just change this to 90 degrees. And what that does is, by default, the gradient line goes from the bottom and goes up to the top, which is 0 degrees on the color wheel. And what we've done is we've changed it to 90 degrees. So now it goes from left to right. And now it's very, very obvious that this is dark and this is light. So it's actually, you could actually stop here if that's all you wanted to do, was to prove that Arthur Shapiro isn't a quack, right? And this is actually is a real thing. But we're going to kind of follow the spirit of this thing. We're going to try and recreate it exactly as Shapiro built it. So we're going to add one extra little thing. We're going to play around with color stops. So if you're familiar with Photoshop or Illustrator, it works kind of the same way, but we're just doing it in code, where we can actually decide or tell the gradient where we want the gradient to start and stop. Because right now, the color white starts here, and then the gradient starts immediately. And then it stops at the black here. But what we can do is we can tell it when we want the gradient to start. So we can do 25%. And now it's going to be white. So this part will be white until we get to 25% of the thing. And then the gradient starts, and it'll go right to the end. So if we wanted to, we'll throw in 75. So now the gradient is only being used in half of this. And what we can do is basically make them meet up in the middle. And then you got yourself a two color split, or a split color gradient. And it seems kind of like a weird, obscure kind of thing that you would do for a gradient. But I want to turn your attention to some of the spoilers. So I gave you the spoiler here. And this is more of the cascade. You can copy and paste this whole thing, and it'll work because of the way that CSS works. Each one of these declarations is going to overwrite the ones that came before it. So I really only listed all three just for completeness. But if you wanted to get into some of the things you could use split color backgrounds in, is Mandy Michael. This is linked to actually one of her lectures, which is beautiful lecture on creative text effects. So she actually created this one. This is kind of how I learned this whole trick of how to do split color. And there's a couple of things that play here, but this actually works all the way down to IE 8, I believe, where she has a split color background, and then she used pseudo elements with absolute positioning to kind of take this. And you can actually, oh, this isn't the wrong one, but on some of these, if you go through them, they're actually editable, selectable, and searchable text, which is really nice. She also has this one, which is basically the same thing, but you do 90 degrees. You can like do basically any kind of degree. So she does like a lot of really cool things. And again, this is actually, no, this is not another one. These are old ones. All of her newer ones are all editable. And then this one, which I believe is 3 colors. And you can see over here how she actually has built them. She's just playing with the color stops. And instead of using CSS color name, she's using the RGB. So yeah, that's kind of a way if you wanted to kind of get into how you can kind of use this in a real scenario. So we did have a question about just Flex in general. And yeah, Flexbox is weird. It's one of those things that it's deceptively simple when you get into it. And it's kind of built that way. It's built to be very usable and extensible. It's one of the more modern declarations that we have. But we do have quite a bit of control on how we can do things. So I'm going to bring your attention to the justify content. So remember, everything on the left-hand side of this is going to be applied to the container. So we actually tell the Flexbox container how we want the items inside that container to be organized or to be laid out. So I've kind of cheated. I've just used margin auto because just by sheer luck, the way that margin auto works, it actually centers the circles exactly how I want them to be centered for this particular illusion. But let's say that we had some other thing that we wanted to do. We could use a lot of these declarations to actually control the specifics of how we want to lay these things out. So we're just going to play around with justify content here, which Flex will switch it depending on what direction you want to go in. And we'll kind of take a look at that on the mobile side of things. But justify, because Flex is in a left-right direction by default, justify content is just like justifying text inside Word or Google Docs, is that you have left, right, center, but they've also given us space between, space around, space evenly. And what margin auto does is it mimics the space around for justify content. So if we actually go back to here and instead of the margin auto, I think we can still actually just keep the way. We can actually go here and we can do a justify content space around, and it does the exact same thing. But we also have these other ones. So we can do, for example, space between. And oh, it's not working. I think I have to get rid of this margin auto. Yeah. So if we margin auto it, it's going to remove all of the things that we've done before. So now it's actually just going to be at the top because that's the default. And space between just puts all of the extra space in between the two circles. We can do, for example, center, and it will actually put them in the center. So think of these as if they were global navigation in a website. This is kind of how you would do it in the real world. You wouldn't be setting the width and the height explicitly. You would be using padding along with the actual size of the text to control the size. But this is how you would actually change where a navigation bar would sit, for example. And if we wanted to kind of change it in the up and down direction, There's a different term for that called a line. So we're going to be justifying content here, but for some reason, I don't really know why, they called it align items instead of align content. I kind of know why, but I'm not going to kind of describe it for you. But we can do align items, center, and now it actually throws everything down into the center. And we can do, for example, even flex end, and it will put them down on the bottom. And this is where I'm gonna like use that reset that I talked about, because notice that we have this pesky little scroll bar on this thing. It's not actually full width, and we have this little bit of a margin on here. And we can actually see that if we inspect the element. And we take a look at this body tag, we can go to the computed tab in the inspector and click on this little thing called browser styles. And this will actually tell us the defaults that every browser has. So if we put margin in here, you'll notice that this browser, Firefox at least, puts by default an 8-pixel margin around the entire thing. And body is kind of weird. With every other element, margin's on the outside. But because body is the top level element of the viewable part of a page, the margin kind of comes on the inside. So we're going to take care of that by going back into our article, and we're just going to scroll down to the bottom. We're going to steal a little bit of sample code here on resets. This is what we call in the industry a reset, is basically turning off or changing the default behavior of a browser because it's a pain in the butt. And the reason why they haven't changed it, everyone kind of resets the margin because nobody really likes that 8-pixel space around them, but you can't change it because browsers have to be backwards compatible. So as soon as they publish a default for a browser and a spec, they can never change it. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna assign a margin of 0 to the body, and that should clear everything up. And we're just gonna, I'm gonna throw that at the bottom actually. Doesn't, normally you put this at the top, but we're just gonna put it down here. Do a margin 0, and now all of a sudden that that scroll bar is gone. So it's one of those things where a lot of times you don't even realize the scroll bar is there, and then you have to kind of like, oh my God, when you do figure it out, like what the heck is going on here? That's just the extra margin. So margin is actually added over and above the width and the height that you set. So since we set it to 100 viewport high and it's 100% wide by default, once you add the margins on top of that, it now makes the page bigger than the viewport, hence the scroll bar. So that just kind of is something that a lot of people use because the fashion right now is have hero sections. Which a hero section is that big image that you see the first time you load a page. And Flexbox and Grid are the tools that we now have available to actually control where things sit inside a viewport. So let's go back. Let's not use margin on. Let's actually keep using this. So we're going to do align items center and a justify space around, and we're back to where it was before we added the margins. So that's kind of like in a nutshell what Flexbox does. You will be mostly using this one in the real world if you're an actual developer, but there's a lot of tutorials out there. I recommend Wes Boss's What the Flexbox. It's a little long, it's 20 videos, but it's free. You have to submit your email and all that, but it's a really great tutorial for that. But even once you get the basics of Flexbox, one of the rules of being a good coder is to not memorize anything. You want to be a lazy coder. So without memorizing anything, you always open this puppy up, because unless you do it over and over again, you're not going to remember what any of these things do. So I've just used justify content here, and if we scroll a little bit farther, we also have align items down here. So this kind of shows you all the different ways that we can actually do things. So if we did like a stretch, this would horribly break our layout. Oh, no, it doesn't. That's good, because it does not override my width and my height. So if I didn't have a width and a height, it would actually make these divs go all the way from the top to the bottom. But luckily, it doesn't do that. So we're just going to center it. And then we're going to move on. And if you want, if we have time left over, we can kind of go into a flex a little bit more if you guys want to get more into that. Just check the chat. Cool. All right, so let's move on to the toughish part, the images. So this is where I'm going to do that divergent thing. I'm going to go not how I did it in the article, but I'm going to go through the article anyway. So when we get into whether or not to use a CSS image or an HTML image, there's a number of different reasons why you would do one over the other. In a semantic sense, you would use an HTML image if that image can be considered actual content. So for example, if you were an artist and you had a gallery of all of your art that you would actually want to put on your website, you could consider that actual content that you would be serving to the user. So an image tag is probably the best way to do it. However, if the image was presentational, so for example, if we did a hero section, for example, so best hero sections of whatever, pick this one. Example of a presentational image. So it's not really there for the actual express purpose of whatever that page is doing. It's actually to make it look pretty. So you use a CSS image. This also would be a CSS image. And if you go down there, this also, of course, would be a CSS image. And one of the things that you would be running into is like, okay, what if I could do both? Is it wrong to use a CSS image when it should be an image tag? Not really. Like, there are some ups and downs to both the ways that you want to do it. A lot of times it'd be pragmatic. For example, this is kind of geared towards beginners. And even though it's more lines of code than we need for an HTML image, it does operate in a more intuitive way. So that's why I did the background images. And also this opens the door, giving you the skills to actually build things like this, this hero section and this hero section. Here you can almost see a split background. You might actually be able to do a gradient here and then overlap a semi-transparent image or a clip mask over top of this. There's a lot of things you can do with CSS. And just to show you that it actually works, I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to add some HTML here that would actually do this. And I'm going to put this outside of the Flex container. And I'm just going to use another div. Which I just realized will break other things that we've done. So I might not go too far into this. Let's actually do an article tag so it doesn't break our CSS. So now we have an article tag with a class of image. I could target this with a class selector. So I've only been using type selectors, the tag type. I am now targeting the element based on the class that we have. If you're not familiar with classes, classes are just a way for you to add tags. Kind of like a tag cloud, you can put more than one kind of word associated with an article. We're just basically attaching labels on these elements so that we can target them in CSS. And I'm just gonna straight paste the stuff that was actually in that, minus this extra thing that I forgot that I copied. Now, if we scroll, we'll find that the image is down here. So now we see a hero image. Essentially, this is the hero section, the first thing that's kind of loads above the fold. And this could be the actual article, for example, on a traditional web page. But what we've done is we've just used a background image. So I've created this article tag. I've made it 100 viewport widths wide and 100 viewport heights high. So it's going to be the full size of the viewport. And then I've used a background image. So every element, every box in the browser has a background. And that background operates the same mostly across different elements. So what I've done is I've given it a background image, and then I've set it to cover. So if I actually remove these two, we see the default behavior of what background images do. Number one, they repeat, because this is using lorem pixum. So this is an image service. If you go to pixum.photos, you'll see like an entire, all these ways that you can actually use placeholder images. So this is a placeholder image service that I use in all my classes. A lot of people use them for mockups. Works out really well. They're openly licensed. It's a really nice service. And this is what we use as another CSS function called the URL. And it just takes this image and we're telling it to be 500 pixels wide by 500 pixels high, and it just places it. And when it runs out of space, it just repeats it over and over and over again. So the way that we actually change this is that we do a background cover, which basically tells it to make the spread out to the full size of the element. So this is actually going to be at a lower contrast because it's only 500 by 500 being spread out to, it looks like about 800 by 800. But it's actually, the image itself spreads out from the top left corner. So in order for it to spread out from the center, we're going to do a background position of center. And that's basically the long and short of how you would do a CSS image. I'm going to break this a little bit. I'm actually going to use an HTML image just so that you can see what this looks like. And actually, before I do that, I'm going to steal this URL. We're going to use an image tag. So an image tag, HTML. And the reason why this kind of, it might hang you up is because we're now not working in the presentation layer. We're now in the content layer. And image is a very kind of special element. It doesn't contain content. It's replaced by content. So even though there's a tag here, notice that there's no closing tag. So it doesn't actually wrap content like a normal element would. It references this image. It goes out to the internet, pulls it down, and the browser replaces this entire image or this entire element with this image. So this is now actual content sitting in the page as if it was a paragraph or a word or a block quote or a bulleted list. And of course, we're going to add an alt tag. We're just going to do random lorem pixum. And this is new than what I'm about to do. So for performance reasons, even though I did tell you that we are going to do, we're not kind of talking about performance, I do want to kind of bring this out because this is actually new. It's not very often that, you know, we actually get an update of like, okay, there is like a lot of different ways to do things, not usually a right and wrong way. This is definitely the right way now, but it used to be the wrong way. So when we're dealing with HTML content images, you should add the width and the height to them. And the reason for that is that, let's say this is a larger image and it takes a while to download. When you give it a width and the height in the content, that means the browser knows what the aspect ratio is or the size of the image before it downloads. So it can actually draw the rest of the page before that image finishes downloading. And the reason why, like this is how we used to do it way back in the olden times, like 2005, 2006. And then CSS kind of got ahead of steam around that time, right around when the iPhone was coming around, 2006. And it caused some problems. If you define your width and your height, you sometimes run into problems with your aspect ratio. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a second. But just in 2019, all the browser makers kind of got together and they figured out a better way to do it so that After 2006, we kind of stopped doing this. We stopped doing width and height because it caused problems in the CSS. They've since fixed that. So when you're dealing with HTML images, it is now proper practice to add the actual width and the height to the HTML for performance reasons. For our purposes, we don't need to, but I'm showing it to you just to be a good internet citizen. And we'll take a look at what this actually looks like here. So I'm actually going to make a little tiny change. I'm going to take a specific image. I believe this one is a good one. Okay, so now we have this nice deer photo. And the reason why I'm going specifically for this one, every time that I update the code, it updates the image and it pulls down a new image. It's kind of a pain in the ass because it always seems to scroll up to the top, if you noticed. So I'm going to do a specific image so that this now will not go up to the top. Hopefully, we'll see. But we do need to make this 100 viewport width and height. So we're going to do the same thing that we did to the border. Or not to the border, to the container. We're going to do viewport widths. So now this thing is kind of like 2 pages. We have the above the fold, which is an entire viewport. Then we scroll down, and we have another one that's exactly the viewport. Except we have this really little tiny weird space at the bottom. And that's another thing to do with the box model and defaults, browser defaults. Because by default, this image tag is an inline element. So it's treated like a word. So what this little space at the bottom here is the line height. Line height is always going to be taller than what the actual content is, because it has to keep track of like those little dips with G's and Y's. It needs to add a little bit of extra space. So to get rid of that, this is almost like a reset. We're now going to do a display block, which kind of removes that little bit at the bottom there. So we're going to do a display block. And now you can't really notice because I've actually made this 500 by 500, and this happens to be kind of a squarish photo. But if we did, say, for example, 50 viewport width, you'll notice that the aspect ratio totally breaks. So that is why we used to not do this, is that by defining both dimensions, it would often really screw up your viewport. The only way to get around that would have been to do an auto, and that tells the browser, okay, respect aspect ratio first, and it'll take the width, or the height, which is 100 viewport high, and it'll do the width as auto, and it'll actually make it so that the aspect ratio is okay. But then we get this little space at the bottom. If we want to do it the other way, it would go the other direction, where it's not quite viewport high. Notice that it's taller than the viewport. So I'm going to show you a nice little trick on how to do that. We can actually do this. We can't tell, but the aspect ratio is broken, and you want to avoid that at all costs. It's largely considered when you break your aspect ratio, you've broken your page. For usability reasons, for aesthetics, tons of reasons. It just makes you look like an amateur, so just be careful when you're doing this. What I'm going to do to fix this is a wonderful little declaration that they gave us called object fit. And what it does is very similar to the background size when it was a CSS image. And we're going to do cover. Now what it does is it is still completely one viewport, and we can also do contain. So what it does is it fixes the aspect ratio so that you can still explicitly set your width and your height on your image. And if it's contained, it'll just add little bars to make up for the extra height. But we're going to go with cover. And what it does is instead it will fill the entire element and it'll crop anything left over. And by default, it'll do it from the center. So we don't have to do that background position of center anymore. But yeah, this is like what an HTML image would look like if you're doing it. And that's basically our full viewport image. Now we have to kind of talk about how we're actually going to overlap this. So overlapping, this is a little bit tougher than this one because we get this overlap for free just by using a background image. What we want to do is we want to pull this image and place it on top of this one. And the browser hates doing that. The browser is actually not in flow mode, in normal flow. It does not want to overlap anything. So in the article, I've given you the classic way of doing it, which is position absolute with a top of 0 and a left of 0. And I'm just going to do this really quickly to show you what that looks like. So once we put this down, nothing seems to really change. But what it's done is the browser has pulled that image out of the document flow and then placed it exactly where it was, which doesn't seem like, you know, it's a big change, but it is a big change in that it is document flow. It's now independent. It's kind of floating around. But by default, it floats exactly where it normally would have been in normal flow, the way it would have been positioned. But another thing that position absolute does is it turns on left, right, bottom, and top. And these are 4 declarations that we can use to actually move this anywhere that we want. So we're just going to do left at 0, which is actually still 0. So what we're telling it is that the left side should be on the left side of the window. Not a whole lot of change here. But then we can do top. We can tell the top edge of this to go to the top of the page. And now we didn't see anything. But if I scroll, I'm scrolling right now, it's not actually doing anything. This is now just one page. Those pixels or those circles and the background are now underneath this image. And we can see that by changing the source order. So let's move this image up the main. And now, ooh, it still has like gone over top of it, which is unfortunate. Now this should be on there. It doesn't do it, so I'm just going to ignore that. So we're just going to put this back over here. We're almost like one step away, but I'm just going to show you how to make it semi-transparent. We're going to make it semi-transparent first. Then we're going to go back and I'm going to show you a different way that we can overlap this. But I want to do this just to show you that it's actually overlapping. And this is actually the anticlimactic part. Opacity, pretty straightforward. So now we can actually see that there are circles underneath this image. And by making it 50% transparent, we actually see the full illusion as it stands, where this is still gray, this is still gray, but because of the background, our brain is tricking us into thinking that this is actually darker than this circle, which it's not. But now that we have a semi-transparent image, let's actually go back and change this. So it's back down at the bottom. We now have a semi-transparent, now looks washed out because you can see the white background behind it. We're going to use grid for this one. And this is going to be another kind of like, you know, I'm not going to get too much into grid. We can get into it a little bit after the break or after we're done this. But there is also another one that I haven't linked to because I didn't do grid. But if you do the complete guide to grid, you see handy dandy tricks is that I made 2 articles, one for Flexbox grid, also with Flex. Remember which one it's on. Maybe it's up here. Yeah, I'll just use the Flexbox one because it's kind of the same. But grid operates on much the same principle as Flexbox. There's the container, which in this case right now is the body element. And then we have the items that are sitting inside it. And I'm not going to use too much of grid. I'm actually kind of cheating this grid thing, where grid is all about kind of like spreadsheets, where you can create columns and we can create rows. And what grid does, it auto places its children specifically according to an algorithm that, you know, it's not trivial to understand, but we don't need it for this point. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually cheat the system here. So on the body, which, remember, the way that we've built this, the body is actually the tag that's outside, just outside of this HTML panel. So you can't see it. And that's basically because we're using CodePen. If we were using like a real HTML page in VS Code, we would be able to see the body tag. But we can expect it later. But there is a container out here. And because grid works the same way as Flex, this is going to be the first child. This entire main element will be an item. And this image will be an item. So when we set up grid, we're going to set up a template. And that's where we tell it how many rows and how many columns we're going to use. And we're going to make the most simplest grid that we possibly can. It's going to be one column and one row. So it's just going to be one cell. And to do that, we get into grid. And when we're talking about display, like when you use the display property, think of it as, remember we were talking about a nuclear power plant. There's all these switches, an entire wall of switches that operate in the browser. What display does is it's a major breaker. It's a giant one that will actually set the defaults on a whole bunch of different switches so that when you're in block mode, all these switches change to paragraph mode. If you do a display inline, a whole bunch of things will change to word mode to treat it like words. And same with Flex and same with grid. And what we've done here is we've just threw a giant breaker that changes the way that a whole bunch of things operate. And this tells the browser that, okay, we want to work with the grid formatting context. And the first step in doing this is setting up our template. And, not grid. So what I've done is I've basically told the browser that I want the entire body of this web page is a grid. I notice it still works just fine. But if I do, say, for example, this, now notice that everything's side by side. Because what I've told it is I want two columns. What FR means is it's kind of like auto. It's a fractional unit. It just kind of distributes the columns according to this algorithm. And what's happening here is that this image is now being placed along a column. So this main element is one column. This image is another column. And I can remove that, go back to one column. And what it'll do is that when it has this first item, it'll place it in the first column, and then creates a whole new row by default to place that image. And there's a lot of ins and outs to grid. We're not going to get too deep into this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use overlap. I'm going to use explicit grid placement. And when I'm doing this, we can go back to our complete guide to grid. And like I said, this operates much the same as the Flexbox article, where these are all the container declarations. These are all the item declarations. And what we've done is we've basically created a grid template column, grid template rows. And then on this side, we have ways of actually placing these things. So basically when you think about grid lines, and we'll see if I can find the stupid So these are the grid lines. So when you want to count by grid, this is the first grid line. So this is grid line number 1, grid line number 2, 3, and 4. 4 columns. So if there's 3 columns, there's always going to be 4 lines. And then similarly with rows, this is going to be the grid line for rows 1, 2, and 3. And what happens with grid is that you can actually count backward. So this is 1, this is -1. So you can count from the other side. So -1, -2, -3, -4. And what we can do is explicitly tell grid where we want to put these items. And what we're going to do is we're going to put both of these items in the same cell so that they overlap one on top of each other, just like we did with absolute positioning, but we're going to use grid. And if you're getting kind of lost, first of all, I apologize for that. I just thought it'd be fun to kind of show you guys different ways of doing things. We can talk more about grid if you guys want after the stream, but we're going to go back to our handy dandy little thing, and we're going to use what's called a grid row and grid column, where we actually tell it which lines to start and which lines to stop. And we're going to do 2 things. We got our image, and we got our main, because this main is grid item 1, this image is grid item 2. And we're going to tell both of these. So I'm just going to use a group selector. What this group selector does is it means it's going to apply these declarations to both of these elements, so the main and the image. And the way the grid column works is you tell it when to start and when to stop. So we're going to tell it to start at grid line 1, and then we're going to tell it to stop at the end. So we did -1. So on this handy dandy thing, this is 1, this is -1. The only difference with us is that we don't have columns. We only have 1 cell, right? So I could just as easily have used 2, where 1 is the first grid line, and because it's only 1 cell, 2 is the second grid line. So I'm telling it to be in this column. And then what we have to do, we have to do the same thing on this one. And now we got overlap again. So this is kind of a little bit more, how would I put it, a little more advanced. If you want to learn more about this, I've actually included this link here, explicit item placement with CSS Grid. And this goes to layout land. So Jen Simmons, she works for Mozilla. She's in the CSS working group. Once this thing. Jen, pretty sweet, super smart. But basically overlap on the web. So it's an 8-minute video, and she basically goes through the ins and outs of how you can actually create really, really nice layouts, like overlapping layouts with grid that aren't possible with absolute positioning. With our example, it's pretty straightforward, where it's just 1 cell. We're just telling both items to be in the same cell. 1 overlaps on top of the other, and we still get this nice contrasting effect. All right, so we're just about almost done. We got 10 minutes left before 8. I just want to kind of cover the last little bit here. We're cleaning things up with resets. I did do that margin auto. Another one that you're probably going to find handy later on is box sizing. I don't need it for this one. Box sizing, it just really talks about how, for example, when we had the margin and it added after the width was set, this basically controls how widths are calculated and whether or not padding and borders are actually taken into account when that width is done. So normally when you say a width of like 200 pixels, it'll take the 200 pixels as content, and then if there's a padding, it'll add the padding onto that, and then it'll add the border onto that. So what we're doing with box sizing border box is that we're actually making it so the width is the border plus the padding plus the content all in one, so that you just have more, yeah, it's more intuitive when you're actually sizing things. But margin is never ever included in the width of an item. That's kind of the basics of box model properties. The width is always added extra. So I'm not going to add that one because it doesn't do anything. It wouldn't change much. One thing I am going to do though is I'm going to add some support for mobile. So for mobile, we're kind of lucky in that if we went like this, you know, we don't have a lot of like different components here to like take into account. When you're building a responsive website, like a larger website, not trivial, kind of making things work with mobile. But what we're going to do is we're going to make this basically when it's in the portrait orientation, we're just going to reverse the direction so that the circles are on top of each other. And we do that with a media query. So media queries, they're a really old and classic way of doing responsive design. Luckily with Flexbox and Grid, they actually have been built with responsiveness in mind. So there's actually a lot of ways that you can create responsive websites without using media queries. But I'm going to use this one and not in the way that we normally would use it. So if you're not familiar with media queries, it's basically a way of telling the browser selectively, conditionally, when to apply certain declarations. And what media does is it allows us to ask the browser questions, and it will give us back answers. And based on those answers, we can make decisions on what CSS to actually load. And normally in the real world, when we're actually doing this as developers, we're going to be basing these based on screen width, just because a device, mobile device is smaller than a larger device. So we'll have like media queries called breakpoints that will kick in when you're at a very small screen width on a phone, medium screen width on a small laptop or a tablet, and then larger when we get into desktops. And we can selectively kind of declare CSS based on the questions of what the browser's telling us. So the browser will actually say, oh, I'm only 500 pixels wide. Oh, please use these declarations so you look good on the phone. Oh, okay, thank you, web developer that I don't know. I'm not going to use widths. I'm going to use another one called orientation. If I can spell it. And it takes portrait or landscape. So I'm now telling it to apply these specific CSS declarations only when the width is smaller than the height. There's also aspect ratio. You can actually do media queries based on specific aspect ratios. But basically what I want to do is I want to make this thing flip right when it gets to the square size. So if it's wider than it is taller, it'll be like this. If it's narrower than it is taller, then it'll flip. So the way that we do that is now we have nested queries. I'm going to take my container. It's up here. So we did display flex. If we go into our handy dandy guide to Flexbox, we scroll down, we scroll down, we scroll down. Oh, and I didn't find it. Where is it? I went right past it. Flex direction. So we have this property that is applied to the container because it's on the left-hand side of this article, where we can tell it to go either in row or in column. So when it's in portrait, let's make it go to column. So we're applying this to the container. So we're going to add a main. And we're just going to do flex direction, column. So now if we go smaller, now we can see it changes. So as soon as it's square, it'll flip. That's our breakpoint right there. But we also have to flip this gradient. So if we wanted to flip the gradient, I believe we applied the gradient to the main tag. So we're just going to keep going with that. And we're going to rewrite this thing. Now this is at 90 degrees right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to flip it to 180 degrees. It's going to be white, starting at 50%. It's going to go to black, also starting at 50%. And boom, and then we're done, basically. So now this thing will flip once it gets wider, or based on the orientation, if it's portrait or not. And seems to be fairly responsive. So at this point, I can save this. And I can take that share link and I can actually text it to my mom. And then when I go and visit her tomorrow, I'll force her to actually open up her phone and click on the link, because she hates technology and she has no interest in any of the things I do when it comes to web development. But if I can ever convince her to open up something on her phone, because she doesn't have a laptop, now I can have something that actually looks decent. Because if we don't do this and we don't take mobile into account, you know, it works, but as soon as you get a little weird, like it just, you know, just no balance on there, right? So we're going to add that, which should flip it. And for some reason, it doesn't seem to be kicking anymore. I think I broke the code pen. But yeah, that basically kind of gets us into responsive, very, very light responsive. Like this is just kind of dipping into it a little bit. When you get into like responsive design, that is probably like half the work of developing a website. You kind of develop it in your browser on desktop, and then you go to mobile. But a lot of people would go mobile first. I find it very difficult. I usually do it in the desktop and then I go back to it. You gotta kind of think about like your heading sizes, how big your fonts are. You definitely have to think about performance if you're dealing with a real world environment. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to give you guys just a little taste so that if you guys were following along on your own systems, start up a CodePen account. And CodePen is actually a really nice way of sharing code and kind of just showing off, showing people what you've done. If you've got kids, you can use this example. And this is all MIT. So if it's open and licensed, please feel free, chop it, do whatever you want with it. The only thing that's really copyrighted material is the illusion itself, which I really like. Go to Curiosity Stream if you've watched all of Netflix like I have. There's a lot of really great stuff on there. I plan on doing a few more of these around other illusions that are in that system. And there's also another couple documentaries on art. So I'm gonna keep going down this kind of vein of just doing artsy fartsy stuff that you wouldn't normally you know, see in the real world. But unfortunately, you know, nobody's gonna pay you to build these illusions. You know, I might, because, you know, it's actually part of what I do. But yeah, this is kind of like the first kind of glimpse of kind of the direction I want to go for this. And I'd love some feedback if you guys have it. We do have a Discord server. So I posted the link in the email that I sent you guys yesterday. So click on that link, kind of jump into Discord if you guys want. And I plan on being there most Saturdays. So things are kind of booting up for me. School-wise, which means I'm going to be teaching from Monday to Friday. So I don't have a lot of extra time during the week, but Saturdays I've kind of booked off for open office hours. So if you guys would like to kind of keep going down this road, or if you just want to learn in general, I'm here to help. I teach for a living. I do this, yeah, for a living, and I love it. I really, really love teaching. I used to have an agency. I've been a developer for 20 years. I'm really bored of doing sliding navigation menus and hero sections and block quotes and call-out boxes, because I'm constantly teaching beginners the basics so they can get hired. I'm doing this so that I can actually hopefully convince people to just learn how to code for the fun of it. Teach your kids. When you have anyone that you want to teach, if you're actually an intermediate coder, my theory is that if you teach, you will learn way quicker.